So, as we're talking about storytelling, I have to ask, are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. So, storytelling seems to be like the biggest buzzword, or one of the biggest buzzwords in music marketing right now, and it feels like we're kind of in a bit of an age of a golden era of storytelling in music. But then, you know, that kind of got me to thinking, you know, well, what is the story? You know, why is storytelling so important in music marketing now? And I think it's because we all relate to stories, right? It's kind of how we understand things, how we relate to life, to each other. It's kind of how we build our identities, actually, in a way. So storytelling can help to create an emotional connection between the listener and fan. It can help to convert listeners from being just a casual listener who might, you know, come across you once or twice to actually becoming a much more engaged fan. And why is that? Well, I think it's because you're much more likely to invest emotionally and financially in an artist if you know the story behind their music. And of course, that doesn't mean that it's just about the music, but when the artist is communicating their personality, their values, their history, you know, it kind of invites you into their world a little bit, and it invites you to become part of that world and to become part of a community of like-minded fans as well. And I think it's fair to say that in a streaming-dominated music industry, the power of storytelling is really more important than ever. Because, and this is something I did mention in the marketing panel earlier, when audiences are primarily discovering songs through playlists, then their connection to the music actually kind of becomes about the song and not the artist. So when people are discovering music through a playlist, they've chosen to engage with a particular context or a purpose of that playlist rather than with the artists themselves. And in the streaming and playlisting ecosystem, it tends to be the streaming services and the content, the playlists that they create, which kind of become the gatekeepers. So it's become increasingly difficult, I think, for artists to connect with an audience actually on streaming services themselves and to sort of build their identity. I can see Cherie Hugh from Forbes sitting in the audience, and hi Cherie, and I'm going to embarrass her now because she recently wrote a great piece on Forbes. I highly recommend you check it out, about the band Glass Animals and why they gamified their most recent album, which is called How to Be a Human Being. How great a title is that, by the way? I think that pretty much sums up everything we're trying to talk about here, actually. And Cherie described that when you are sort of discovering music or an artist on a playlist, you know, or an album page on a streaming service, it can be really hard to sort of find any context around that because you're literally just kind of coming across the music as a track list on a black background, right? Just taking Spotify as an example, or it might be a white background if you're on Apple Music. So yeah, there isn't really any context or interactivity, you know, around a song or an album page or a streaming service, and there isn't really a way to connect with an artist and find out more and find out about the story behind the music. So I think right now as music marketers, we are very concerned with, finding out who the artist is, what their story is, how they want to communicate that, and sort of creating a narrative around that which, you know, will help to build their identity, to engage with their audiences, to find their fans and try and convert them on a bit of a deeper level, engage with them on a much more personal level. And then, of course, we also spend a lot of time thinking about what are the best ways to communicate that story. So it might be, you know, a combination of streaming and live and PR and advertising, CRM, all of those different formats and more. But I think that in itself is not enough. Because if we're only focusing on one side of the story, and by that I mean the artist side of the story, then I think we're missing a point that if you really want to engage audiences on a much deeper level and really create a proper emotional connection with your listeners, then the artist story needs to form part of a much bigger narrative. And by that I mean one where the listener's story intersects with their own. There's a media strategist called Nick Susi, S-U-S-I. I highly recommend you check him out. He wrote some really interesting pieces recently for Berkeley online. And he was talking specifically about this exact issue, kind of the struggle to build artist identity in an increasingly streaming-dominated era. And he said, music's not about the artist, actually. It's about the stories being lived by the listener, and it's about how they relate to the music, And he said that stories actually transcend any specific artist or song. That's how important they are. So it kind of got me thinking, why does a listener care about the artist and the music that they like? And for me, that very much comes down to how they make them feel. Because I think we're not just living in the attention economy, which we are, and it's harder than ever for artists to get attention, but we're also living in the emotion economy. How you make people feel is really how you get their attention. And those are kind of all very much tied in together. But, that goes deeper than just the artist's story, right? Because how a song makes you feel is about how it intersects with your own story, your own life, your mood, your emotions, your context at any given place or time when you're listening to that music. It's about how you relate to the song and the artist in a given context in any given time. There's another researcher who I highly recommend checking out. He's called Kyle Bylin, Bylin, and he wrote a new book called Song Stories recently. And the introduction to that is brilliant. I highly recommend the whole book, of course. But in the introduction, he wrote, and I'm going to quote him directly here, he said, "Songs become part of the story of our lives. Their lyrics linger inside of us. We recall the words, but what we remember isn't what they meant to the person who wrote them, it's what they mean to us. We relate their lyrics back to the events that happen in our lives. We interject our own personal narrative into their songs, and we feel as though they mirror our own memories and our emotions." And I just thought that was a great quote, actually, that kind of really sums up perfectly what I'm trying to say in this presentation. Because think about how songs make you happy, and others make you sad, and others make you nostalgic, and they might make you remember a particular time or a place in your life. Some songs kind of connect with our present, others connect with our past. Sometimes they're tied to particular moments in our lives. And playing that song later down the line can help us to remember what we felt at that particular time when we kind of first listened to that song. And that's what music does for us, as again I was saying earlier. It kind of connects us with our past and with our present. It connects us with each other. It creates meaning. It kind of helps us to understand our lives to the extent where it really does. It's become a key way in which we form our own identities, actually. And neuroscience has even proved that music lies at the heart of human relationships, because it actually evolved as as a way for us to communicate before we even had language. That's how primal our connection to music is. And I think that that's why it's so important that in music marketing we not only understand and convey the artist's story, but that we also understand how the listener relates and how the music that they're listening to kind of then in turn forms part of their own very personal story. But the problem is that, again, I mentioned all of this earlier, but we have more access to data than ever before, but we're still really only able to segment all our audiences into quite broad brushstrokes, you can understand your demographics and your ages and your locations and your likes and your listening habits, that kind of thing. But we still don't really know the how, why of what causes a listener to interact individually with a piece of music or with an artist. And you don't know what triggered that behaviour in the first place. And you don't know why they do or they don't come back to listen again. And you don't know why they become a fan. And because we can still only really analyse our audiences in large numbers, we're still focused on measuring success by large numbers as well, right? Think about how, as a marketer, generally speaking, you're going to measure success by your numbers of streams or sales or ticket sales, your follower numbers, your video views, all those kinds of things, right? But ultimately, when you think about it, those are just vanity metrics. How much do they really mean? So I think that we need to learn to view audiences as groups of individuals, each with their own motivations and their own triggers and their own cultural context behind engaging with an artist or a story or a piece of music. And I think it's only when we reach that point of being able to understand those motivations and those triggers that we'll really be able to deliver genuinely individual, truly unique experiences for the fans, for the listeners, and to really be able to connect the artist and audience on a properly personal level. I think that right now we're living in an era of mass personalization. For example, Spotify's Release Radar, Discover Weekly Playlist, that kind of initiative. And I think they're incredible. I really do. And I listen to them a lot. But I do think that we also need to move music marketing forward so that it becomes not just one-to-many, i.e. these kind of playlists, but that we're also able to market on a one-to-one basis. And that just reminded me of a story that someone told me recently about an artist who we were actually working with at the Orchard, but I won't name him. But he had an album coming out in February, and he was concerned about journalists, actually in particular, kind of writing cut and paste reactions to his new album, and he felt like that had happened a bit in the past, and they hadn't really understood his story and where he's coming from, and the way that they conveyed it, kind of, the way that they were relating to it, he didn't, see that as being how he'd kind of intended that to be. So he decided to invite journalists to his house, and he was playing them the album individually on a one-to-one basis and kind of talking them through, the whole story behind the music and the inspiration and how he wrote the record and all of that. And so he was basically giving each individual a really unique opportunity to hear his story, to hear the music first, to listen to the album and kind of be able to interpret it and share it in their own way, but kind of through a lens, I guess, of understanding where he'd come from in the first place as well, which I think obviously then inevitably will shape their reaction to it as well. But I love the way that I felt like he's empowering the listeners to really take his story into their own hands and then kind of continue to write it in their own way. Because I think once you put a piece of art out there, you're not going to be able to control how it's being experienced or interpreted or shared. It's the fans who are going to do that for you. The fans now, they have more of a voice than ever. They're the ones who are going to tell you what is and isn't working and what they want. And they're the ones who are going to take your story, interpret it in their own way, share it with their friends, share it with their family, kind of continue to make sure actually that your story is continuing to be written even after you as an artist have long since actually stopped writing that story. So the fans are basically the people who are going to make sure that that story lives on. And I think that, there's a lot of talk in the industry about storage, streaming being about the long game, of course, because you want to get to a point where you're engaging listeners on a repeat basis and, you can make sure that people are coming back to your music time and time again. And they're continuing to stream you on a long-term basis. It's not just about the first week sales. But I feel like if streaming is about the long game, then we need to make sure that storytelling can take both the audiences and the creators on a journey together. And I love this quote from Sampha as well, when he said, I just want to leave music that some kid's going to find and it's going to totally transport them. I love that. That kind of sums up, the aim of the game for me. So I think the next step in music marketing is not just to focus on the artist and their story, but also on the fan. What makes them tick? Who are they? How are they relating to this music? What does it mean to them? So I think the next step for music marketing is that it becomes unique to the fan and to how that music forms part of their own individual story. Because I think, as I mentioned before, that's when we're really going to be able to connect artists and audiences on a much deeper level. So for me, right now, that's the missing part of the puzzle in music marketing. And it's the next chapter to be continued. Thank you guys so much for coming and for listening. I hope that wasn't too much of a repetition of everything I was saying earlier. And if anyone has any questions, please let me know. Give me a shout.